I want to talk a little bit about your reading for this coming week on by Walter Marshall. Just try to give you some context for that. Uh, One thing you might want to know, related to why we're actually reading that, is I did my PhD on Walter Marshall and his theology of sanctification. So it is more obscure of a source than you would probably read in a general overview of a class like this. So usually you wouldn't actually read Marshall unless you were taking a class that was dealing with like 17th century theology of sanctification or something like that, which obviously you're not. But I love it. I spent I first encountered Walter Marshall's book, I guess about uh, 15 years ago, 12 years ago or so. And then I've just read it several times, loved it, really enjoyed it, benefited from it spiritually. And then when it came time to do a PhD, I thought, well, I'll do this project because I think it'll be good for my soul, and hopefully will help other people as well. I saw how Marshall's writings, his theology of sanctification, was helpful for my ministry as I was explaining things to people. I found his way of putting things, though not always the most like the English that I spoke today, yet very, very useful. I found his writings very applicable to ministry. So anyway, that's why I picked him for my dissertation. So yeah, if you go to another talk to somebody who went to another seminary, and you're like, yeah, we read Walter Marshall for the church history class, and the other people don't have no idea who Walter Marshall is, you shouldn't necessarily assume, therefore, that their history class was not quite, up to par. Uh, so anyway, just want to give you that background on Walter Marshall. Now, who is he? What did he do? And more importantly, for our purposes for this class, what is the context that I need to know in order to understand him? So first, a little bit about his life. He was born in 1628, died in 1680. Now, it's interesting, his book was not published until 1692. Why? Because in 1680, when he died, they weren't publishing any Protestant books at the time. That was the restoration of the crown. England was going much more Roman Catholic at the time, so his book was not actually published. Which creates, by the way, just a little bit of an interesting situation. Because if I'm going to understand the context of the book, I need to understand the context in which it was written, which was sometime before 1680. We really don't know when, but probably later on in his life, because his book talks a little bit about a crisis. He had a conversion, not a conversion to Christ experience. Well, he did way earlier, but later in his life, he realized that what he was teaching about justification and sanctification was actually wrong, and he did change, and that occurred later on in his life. And the book is sort of out of that change. So we think that it's probably sometime towards the end of his life. My guess would be maybe he wrote it over the course of several years in the mid 1670s or something like that. But obviously before 1680, because that's the date that he died. Now, it was published in 1692, so the context in which it's published, a lot changed between 1680 and 1682. Or 1680 and 1692. A lot changed in terms of the theological discourse that was going on. So the world into which that book was, which the book came, the world that found the book, was different than the world in which Marshall wrote it. It's kind of an interesting situation there when you think about context. Do I mean the context in which it was written, or do I mean the context in which it was immediately received? Because those are different. You don't really have to worry about that for this class, though. There's enough that's broad and relates to both of those contexts that I think is we can spend, all of our time with that. But what was that context? So you have two factions. You have the antinomians, and then you have what was not called in Marshall's time, but shortly after Marshall's time, called the neonomians. The neonomian was a term that was looking back over a pretty codified theology, but it was just not named Neonomian during the time. It was named later, but that name serves us pretty well. You have the Antinomians on one side and the Neonomians on the other. The Antinomians, if you recall from the previous video related to Calvin, the Antinomians are those who were, well, no one ever, except for like one exception, almost no one ever claimed to be an antinomian. That wasn't a good thing. But it was a term that was used to label somebody you didn't like. If you didn't like somebody's theology at the time, you would just call them an antinomian, because it means that you're against the law. You are, those who were accused of antinomians were basically accused of creating a theological system that made obedience to the law not important. That was the charge against them. Now, as we'll see in our lecture about the Puritan context, that was a very, very serious accusation. There's people who get accused of being antinomians today. A friend of mine, or a guy I knew once, talked about how a friend of his was at a theology conference and he was actually trying to go to the bathroom, and somebody kept coming in and saying, "Antinomian, antinomian," which is a pretty bizarre experience. So occasionally at a theological conference or what, somebody who is, well, not terribly sanctified and has no people skills will just start blasting somebody else and labeling them an antinomian. It could happen today. But see, back then in Puritan England, it was so much more serious, because there was not the distinction between the church and the state that we have today. And so to say that somebody is an antinomian theologically is essentially the same as saying that they are an anarchist, that they are rebellious, that they are encouraging people to disobey the laws of the land, because there wasn't, it was thought that the way to keep people obedient to the civil law was to make sure their theology was right according to the theological rules of the church. So if you ended up with a system that did not encourage people to obey the law, you were basically being seditious. You were being, it was like encouraging rebellion against your country. You were a traitor. So that was an extremely serious charge. But on top of that, there were people who were who would have who had a theology that was very antinomian. There was it's kind of coming out of the army, so you don't want the soldiers to end up with that theology, and yet that's exactly what happened. You ended up with a bunch of young men who got in their idea that the theology they absorbed did not place an importance upon obeying the law, and there were all sorts of abuses, drunkenness and all sorts of problems within the army. Of course, that was a very, very bad situation. If there's anybody, a group of people you want to have strong respect for the law and order, it's those who have guns. And that was not the case. That in England, the army ended up being the place where antinomianism flourished. And so what you had emerge as a response was a theology of neonomianism. Now, neonomian, the etymology of that means a new law. And again, you don't have people who are claiming, hey, I'm a neonomian. Instead, what you have is people saying, attributing that term to somebody's theology that they don't like. So if you don't like somebody's theology, you have your choice of bad things you could call it. You could call it antinomian, or you could call it neonomian. And the whole idea of neonomian is basically this, that the gospel ends up being simply a new law. So it's not a message of forgiveness of sins, that Jesus has obeyed the law for us in our place. We trust in him and we receive that righteousness in our stead. Rather, the gospel ends up being, hey, here's an easier law for you to obey. Yes, the Mosaic law was hard, it had all those statutes, all those requirements. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus has come to give us an easier law to obey. But the essential way in which I relate to God is still one of law. It is still one of do this and you will live. And so neonomianism basically says that the gospel is just a new law. Granted, an easier law, a law that has more resources that are given to you in order to obey it with the Holy Spirit and the resurrection life and all these things. But in the end of the day, it's basically the same as a new law. So you have the antinomians who are creating a theology in which obedience to God, they say, doesn't really matter. There's no importance of it placed in our theology. And you have the neonomians who are responding to that and who are saying that no, the law matters, so much so that in the end the gospel is just another law. And what you have now is you have this pendulum swing. Each side responds against the other, and it pushes each side further and further and further apart. And they don't understand each other well, and there's a lot of talking past each other. And what's also interesting is that you see the same people sometimes flip-flop. The most hardened, strongest antinomians end up being former neonomians, and the most strongest neonomians end up being former antinomians. So it's like you just swing back and forth and back and forth. And so this is the theological construct. And again, it's not simply a matter of something relegated to theological conferences. No, England in this time, it all really, really, really matters. Another reason it matters is that neonomianism is being accused of just another form of Roman Catholicism. And this is, the years of the Spanish Armada. The Roman Catholics through Spain want to take over England. So, you don't want to be neonomian because, you could be a traitor both ways. You could be a traitor if you're an antinomian because you're accused of not given importance to the laws of England, and you could be a traitor if you're neonomian because, you're just a Catholic spy then. You're sent here from Spain in order to try to overthrow the good Protestant king or queen, as it came to be often with Elizabeth. She was queen for so long during this period, and you're just here as a Catholic spy. So, you could get in trouble for being antinomian, and you could get in trouble for being neonomian. This was a pretty tough time to do theology. But not only that, not only was it caught up into this world of politics that was dangerous, it was also so much a matter of one's own personal heart. Because the question, how do I know that I'm saved, was so important to people. And how is it that I need to be holy? What does holiness look like? Where do I get the resources to be holy? What does God want me to do? This was a time where, I've said some things about theology as how it's gotten into this political battle, but that does not mean it was not also a matter that was deeply personal, highly emotional. It was of the heart. People cared about these things. You could be out in the street and you would hear people talking about how it is that they're struggling to be holy. Holiness really mattered. So you kind of put all these things together. The person who's thinking, I want to be holy, but I'm struggling with this antinomian, neonomian theology. I'm not getting a sense of how I actually walk and please God in my life. And Marshall experienced that sort of back and forth pendulum swing. It was like there was the pendulum going back and forth, and he was there underneath, and it was hitting him on one side and hitting him on the other, and he was just all beat up. He didn't know what to do. And, through that, he has almost a Martin Luther-like moment where he sees the gospel afresh. And now I'm not saying he wasn't saved before this, but although maybe he wasn't. The point is that he receives the gospel in its fullness in terms of what it means not only for justification but also for sanctification, and he lives and writes out of that, and so you see him grow and change, and the glory of the gospel for holiness comes through in his works. So I've given you, I think, the first few what he calls directions in the of his book. They're called directions, by the way, because he means this book to be extremely practical. Your version might say chapters. That is a mistake in terms of the internet-based edition that I gave you. It should say directions, because what he means here is this to be more like a manual for holiness. Here is how you obey. So there are 14 different directions for your obedience and sanctification. And what you'll find as you read this is that it comes back again and again to our union with Christ and the holiness that we have in Christ positionally and truly, and how that is a basis for the holiness that we need to live out our lives experientially in union with this Christ. So I think it is beautiful, freeing theology that I think is so biblical. Marshall is called the most Pauline of the divines. The divines is a name given to theologians at that time, which basically means that Marshall is extremely sensitive to Paul's theology. He's also very sensitive to John's theology because he makes a whole lot about the idea that we love because he first loved us in the book of 1 John. So, our love for God is driven out of God's love for us. And what essentially he does, and this is why I wanted to study Marshall for my PhD, and what I love about his writing so much, is that he confronts antinomianism and neonomianism at the same time. There's this pendulum swing. People are just fighting against each other. They're almost like putting themselves on one side, attacking the other, and that's again driving them further apart. Marshall is saying, he's sort of there planted and saying, look, you're both wrong. And there's some ways in which he actually says, look, you're both on the same side. The real gospel is something that's not antinomianism or neonomianism, but a totally different thing. It's not in the middle. It's an entirely different variety. And that's what we need to grab hold of and invest our lives in. So anyway, I hope you find the book helpful and useful. And it's not the easiest to read. In fact, he was criticized even shortly after that he wrote it. In the next couple centuries, or not centuries, in the next couple of decades, generations, it is said that he requires more than a usual amount of patience in order to figure out what he means. The writing doesn't flow well, but the ideas and concepts, I think, flow very, very, very well. So it's written very logically, and if you can wade through the writing, I think what you'll see is that the concepts are beautiful in terms of the way they fit together. So, with that, enjoy Marshall, and I look forward to talking about it with you.